The photographer raised his camera, and my mother-in-law, Eleanor, gently took my arm. "Just for a moment, dear," she whispered, her voice like honey laced with ice. She guided me out of the frame with a practiced, almost tender pressure. I stood to the side, my feet silent on the thick Persian rug, and watched. There they were, Eleanor, her husband Richard, their daughter Clara, and her family. All of them arranged in front of the grand marble fireplace, the heart of the home my husband Mark and I had poured our lives into restoring. The photographer, a young man I'd hired and paid for this very occasion, their 40th wedding anniversary, called out instructions. "Big smiles, everyone. Perfect. Hold it." The flash went off, a brilliant, blinding white that seemed to suck all the air from the room. In that split second, I saw myself reflected in the dark glass of the bay window behind them. A solitary figure, a ghost at her own family's celebration. Eleanor didn't look at me as I stepped back. She was too busy adjusting her husband's tie, her smile perfectly preserved. Richard just stared straight ahead, a stoic patriarch carved from stone. No one met my eye. It was as if I had simply dissolved into the wallpaper. They called it the original family photo, a keepsake, but I knew what it really was. It was a statement. Mark was gone, and in their eyes, my connection to this family, this life, was gone with him. I was an addendum, a footnote in their history that they were now neatly erasing. The party continued around me, a murmur of polite laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. I moved through the rooms, feeling the weight of a silence that only I could hear. I'd organized every detail: the caterer, the string quartet playing softly in the corner, the gardenias flown in because they were Eleanor's favorite. I had signed the checks. I had made the calls. I had done it all in Mark's memory, wanting to honor the family he had loved so fiercely. But as I watched Eleanor accept compliments on her beautiful party, I felt a deep, chilling cold spread through my chest. This wasn't a celebration of family. It was a coronation, and I was not part of the royal court. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had departed, I was in the kitchen, packing leftovers into containers. The house was quiet now, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock mark, and I had found in a dusty antique shop years ago. Eleanor walked in, her pearls still gleaming against her silk blouse. She didn't offer to help. She just leaned against the counter, observing me. "It was a lovely evening, Lillian," she said, her tone implying that I was merely staff who had performed adequately. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," I replied, my voice even. I refused to let it shake. She sighed, a delicate, theatrical sound. "That photographer was quite good. I can't wait to see the prints, especially the one of just us." The family. The word hung in the air between us. The asterisk family, as if there were no other kind. I paused, my hand still. "It was a nice idea." "Yes," she continued, picking an invisible piece of lint from her sleeve. "It's important to preserve the lineage, the core of it all." There it was again. The quiet, polite blade sliding between my ribs. I wasn't the core. I was just the shell that had once held a part of it. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a picture. A piece of glossy paper that would sit on the mantelpiece, gathering dust. But it did matter. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the quiet, darkened halls of the estate. Every floorboard seemed to creak with memories of Mark. I saw him everywhere. By the window where he used to read, on the stairs he used to take two at a time, in the study where we'd spend hours planning our future. Our asterisk future. I ended up in that study, the air thick with the scent of old books and leather. His presence was strongest here. I ran my hand over his worn armchair, the leather cool beneath my fingertips. On his desk, almost hidden beneath a stack of mail, was his old ledger. It was a simple, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his neat, precise handwriting. When we first took over the failing family business and the crumbling estate that came with it, this ledger was our Bible. Mark tracked every penny, every investment, every sacrifice, and I had been there for every single entry. I opened it, the spine creaking in protest. My fingers traced the columns of numbers, loans we'd taken out, savings we'd poured in, the inheritance my own parents had left me, which we'd used to save the business from bankruptcy a decade ago. It was all there, in black and blue ink. My name appeared beside his on so many of the entries. Mark and Lillian. M and L, our lives, our partnership, documented in careful script. This book held the truth. The truth that this house, this business, this comfortable life they all enjoyed wasn't just theirs. It was ours. It was mine. The photograph felt like a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to overwrite this reality. The next morning, the house felt different. The warmth had gone. It was just a collection of rooms and expensive things. I felt like a tourist, an unwelcome guest who had overstayed her welcome. Richard cornered me in the hallway. He was holding a small, framed photo from the party. Not the asterisk photo, but one of the candids. He was smiling in it, a rare sight. "Good man, that photographer," he said gruffly, without looking at me. He was already deciding where to hang it. "He did a wonderful job," I said, my voice hollow. "Eleanor is ordering a large print for the mantel. The one of the family," he added, as if I didn't know. "A proper portrait." He finally turned to me, his eyes cool and dismissive. "You understand, Lillian. It's about heritage." I just nodded. What was there to say? Arguing would only make me look hysterical, emotional. That's what they wanted. They wanted me to be the grieving, unstable widow who was making things difficult. So I played my part. I smiled politely. I stayed quiet. But inside, something was hardening. The soft, pliable grief was beginning to crystallize into something else, something colder, clearer. Days turned into weeks. The emotional isolation became a physical one. Conversations would cease the moment I entered a room, only to resume in whispers after I'd passed. Decisions about the estate, repairs, landscaping, even what was served for dinner, were made without me. I was living in a house I co-owned, being treated like a tenant whose lease was about to expire. The symbol of it all arrived 2 weeks after the party. A large, flat package from the photographer. I knew what it was before I even saw the label. I left it in the front hall, not wanting to be the one to open it. Eleanor found it, of course. Her gasp of delight echoed from the foyer. I heard the tearing of paper and then her voice calling for Richard. "It's here. Oh, it's just perfect." I stayed in the study, the door firmly closed. I didn't need to see it. I could picture it perfectly. The smiling faces, the perfect composition, the gaping hole where I was supposed to be. The sound of a hammer hitting a nail followed a few minutes later. One single, final, declarative strike. I told myself again that it didn't matter. I told myself I was stronger than this. I told myself that Mark would want me to rise above it. But when I walked past the living room later that day, I couldn't help but glance at the mantelpiece. There it was, in a heavy, ornate gold frame. It was larger than I'd imagined, dominating the space. The centerpiece of the room, the official story of the family. My own wedding photo, the one of Mark and me that had sat on that same mantel for 15 years, had been moved. It was now on a small side table in the corner, partially obscured by a lamp. Replaced. I stood there for a long time just looking. The woman in that wedding photo looked so young, so full of hope. She believed in love, in family, in forever. She had no idea that forever had an expiration date. She had no idea how conditional family could be. That night, rain lashed against the windows of the old house. The sound echoed the storm inside me. I felt a profound loneliness, the kind that sinks into your bones. It wasn't just that I missed Mark, I missed the feeling of belonging somewhere. He had been my anchor, my home. Without him, I was adrift in his family's polite, cruel sea. I thought about leaving, packing a bag and just driving away, selling my share of the business and the house and never looking back. The thought was tempting, a sweet release. But then I thought of the ledger. I thought of the years of work, the sleepless nights, the shared dreams. This wasn't just their heritage. It was mine, too. I had earned my place in this house, in this life. They had no right to erase me from it. But they were trying. Oh, they were trying so hard. The small slights continued, like 1,000 tiny cuts. Eleanor started reorganizing the library, packing away books that she knew were my favorites, replacing them with her own. She spoke of the future, of when Clara's children would one day run the company, never once acknowledging the role I still played in its day-to-day operations. I was being systematically written out of the present, just as I had been written out of the portrait of the past. I became quieter, more observant. I retreated into my work, into the solitude of the study. I spent my evenings with the ledger, but I wasn't just looking at the past anymore. I started cross-referencing it with current financials, with property deeds, with investment portfolios. I started tracing the flow of money, my money, our money, through the veins of this family's legacy. It wasn't about anger. Not yet. It was about understanding. I needed to see, inarguable in black and white, what I already felt in my gut. I needed to quantify the injustice. One afternoon, I overheard Alina on the phone with Clara. Her voice was low, but the study door was ajar. "A difficult position," Alina was saying. "Of course, we have to be delicate, but she can't expect to stay here forever. It's not appropriate." A pause. "Richard is looking into the legalities. How to dissolve the partnership gracefully. We have to protect the estate for the children. For your asterisk children," I thought. The coldness I'd felt before was now a solid block of ice in my stomach. They weren't just excluding me. They were planning to push me out, to take everything Mark and I had built and claim it as solely their own. They mocked my grief with their false sympathy, betrayed the memory of their own son, and refused to acknowledge the truth of my contribution. That night, the house felt like a prison. Every shadow seemed to hold a whisper of their plotting. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep coming to deliver my eviction notice. I felt utterly, completely alone. I had no one to turn to. My own family lived hundreds of miles away, and I had been too proud, too ashamed, to tell them the full extent of what was happening. I had painted a picture of a grieving but supported widow living peacefully with her loving in-laws. Another fiction. I sat in the dark study, the ledger open in front of me. The rain had started again, a soft, mournful tapping against the glass. I ran my finger down a column of figures from 12 years ago. A capital injection of $500,000. It was listed under my name. My inheritance. The money that had saved them from ruin. They had forgotten. Or, more likely, they had chosen to forget. I remembered the day I signed that check. Richard had shaken my hand, his eyes wet with gratitude. "You're a daughter to me, Lillian," he'd said. "You've saved this family." Alina had hugged me, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "We'll never forget this," she'd whispered. Never. How easily they had forgot. How convenient it was to erase a debt when the person you owed it to was no longer a part of the picture you wanted to paint. The quiet cruelty of it all was breathtaking. It wasn't a loud, dramatic betrayal. It was a slow, methodical strangulation of my past, my present, and my future. They were suffocating me with politeness, with feigned concern, with whispers of what was appropriate. My grief was no longer just for my husband. It was for the family I thought I had. It was for the woman I used to be, the one who believed in their goodness. I closed the ledger softly. The sound seemed to echo in the profound silence of the house. I looked around the room, at the dark wood, the rows of books, the life Mark and I had built. They saw it as their legacy, their birthright. They saw me as an obstacle, a temporary complication to be managed and, eventually, removed. A few days later, I came back from a long walk to find a small, neat cardboard box outside my bedroom door. It wasn't large, but its placement was deliberate, precise. A message. Inside, I found a few of my things that had been in the main living room. A silver picture frame holding a photo of my parents. A small porcelain vase I loved. The cashmere throw that I kept on the sofa. Insignificant items, really, but they were mine, and they had been cleared away. It was the final, unspoken word. You don't belong here. Your things don't belong here. Your memories don't belong here. This space is no longer yours to share. I stood in the silent hallway, the box at my feet. I looked down the long corridor towards the staircase. At the bottom, I could just see the living room and the mantelpiece and the grand, golden frame that held their perfect, happy lie. They thought I was just a sad, lonely widow adrift in their world. They thought I would eventually just fade away, leaving them with everything. Theirs was a story of lineage, of blood, of a legacy they felt was owed to them. But I had a different story. A story written in ink, in numbers, in contracts and deeds. A story of partnership, of investment, of sacrifice. A story they had conveniently forgotten how to read. I walked back into the study and picked up the heavy leather ledger from the desk. I held its weight in my hands. It felt solid. Real. That's when I realized they hadn't just removed me from a picture. They were trying to erase a debt. The ledger felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it had any right to be. It was no longer a book of memories, it was a book of evidence. The weight wasn't paper and leather. It was the weight of years, the weight of a truth they were determined to bury. I closed my eyes, picturing the smiling, polished family in the golden frame. They thought the story was theirs to write. They thought because Mark was gone, his half of the story had gone with him. They were wrong. That night, in the silent, imposing study that now felt like the only corner of the world that was truly mine, I made a promise. Not a dramatic, tear-filled promise to a ghost. It was a quiet, cold promise to myself. I would not be erased. I would not let their carefully constructed lie become the official history. I would not let them take what we had built together and pretend I was merely a temporary guest. Mark's memory deserved more than that. And I deserved more than that. The next morning, I began. My first move was to find a lawyer. Not the family's lawyer, a man who had known Richard for 30 years and called Alina by her pet name. I needed someone who owed their loyalty to no one but the facts. And to me, I called an old friend from university, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, who worked in a different city. I kept my voice light, casual. I told her I was just doing some estate planning, getting my own affairs in order. She gave me a name without a second thought, Arthur Harrison, a man she described as a quiet bulldog. Perfect. My first call to his office was nerve-wracking. I made it from my car, parked in a remote corner of a supermarket parking lot, the engine off. I felt like a spy in my own life. His voice on the phone was exactly as I'd hoped. Calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. Back at the house, the performance continued. I had to become the person they expected me to be. The fragile, grieving widow, lost in her memories, slowly accepting her peripheral role. At breakfast, Alina discussed her plans to repot the orchids in the conservatory. "They need a firmer hand, Lillian," she said, not unkindly. "They've been rather neglected." It was a subtle dig. I was the one who had always tended to the orchids. They were my project, my small joy. "You're right," I said, looking down at my coffee. "They'll be much happier with you." I let a small, sad smile touch my lips. She seemed satisfied with that, a little flicker of victory in her eyes. Inside, I felt a glacial calm. Let her have the orchids. I was fighting for the whole forest. The days leading up to my meeting with Mr. Harrison were a strange dance of deception. I spent my mornings feigning listlessness, reading in the garden or taking long, aimless walks. But my nights were filled with a fierce, quiet purpose. Once Alina and Richard were asleep, the house became my own. I moved through it like a shadow, armed with a small flashlight. My target was the attic. It was a cavern of forgotten things, smelling of dust and cedar and time. Boxes and trunks were stacked everywhere, a physical archive of the family's life. Mark and I had stored our old business files up here years ago, after we digitized everything at the office. But I knew the originals were what mattered. I found them in a set of heavy metal filing cabinets tucked away under the eaves. The sound of the drawer sliding open was deafening in the silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. I spent hours up there, night after night, hunched over with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. I sorted through brittle, yellowing papers, incorporation documents, old tax returns, loan agreements, bank statements going back 20 years. My name was everywhere. Lillian Croft. Before that, Lillian Mays. It was a ghost signature from a past they were trying to deny. I photocopied everything. I bought a small, quiet scanner and worked until the first hints of dawn, digitizing every single page. I saved them to a secure cloud server and a password-protected hard drive that I kept hidden in the lining of an old suitcase. During one of these late-night sessions, I heard a floorboard creak downstairs. I froze, my hand hovering over a stack of bank records. The light from my flashlight was off. The darkness was absolute. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming up the main staircase. I held my breath, my body rigid. The steps paused at the top of the stairs, then moved down the hall, away from the attic door. A toilet flushed. A few moments later, the steps retreated. It was Richard. I stayed there in the cold, dark attic for nearly an hour, not moving, just listening to the old house breathe around me. The close call left me shaken, but also more determined. They were careless. They were so confident in their position, in my passivity, that they didn't even think to watch me. They saw a grieving woman. They had no idea they were living with a forensic accountant in the making. My meeting with Arthur Harrison took place in a sterile, anonymous office building downtown. The room was all glass and pale wood, a a stark contrast to the heavy, memory-soaked atmosphere of the estate. Mr. Harrison was a man in his late 50s, with kind eyes that didn't miss a thing. I had expected a bulldog, but he was more like a scholar. He listened patiently for over an hour as I laid out the story. I started with the photograph. I told him about the whispers, the box of my belongings, the overheard phone call. Then, I opened my briefcase and began laying out the documents. The ledger was on top. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his gaze sharp and focused as I walked him through the financials. I showed him the entry detailing my inheritance. I showed him the early partnership agreements with both our names on them. I showed him the mortgage documents for the estate, which listed me as a co-borrower. When I was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. He steepled his fingers, looking at the papers, then at me. "They are not just trying to push you out, Mrs. Croft," he said, his voice measured. "Given the evidence here, they are attempting to commit fraud." The word hit me with physical force. Fraud. It sounded so ugly, so criminal. It was one thing to feel betrayed. It was another to see their actions given a legal name. "What they've forgotten," he continued, tapping a finger on the original business charter, "is that a partnership, especially one this deeply integrated, is like a marriage. Its assets cannot be willed away by one party as if the other doesn't exist. Your husband's share doesn't just default to his parents." He looked at me, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes. "You've done remarkable work here, Lillian. You've built a fortress of evidence. But I suspect there's more." "More?" I asked, my voice thin. "There must be a master agreement. A document that outlines the precise terms of succession in the event of a partner's death. It would have been drafted when you made your initial large investment. It's standard practice to protect such a significant injection of capital." I thought back. It was so long ago. My memory was a haze of grief for my own parents and the frantic energy of saving Mark's family business. I don't remember signing anything like that." "You might not," he said gently. "But your husband sounds like he was a meticulous man. He would have insisted on it. It would have been his way of protecting you." His words echoed in my mind all the way home. His way of protecting you. That night, I didn't go to the attic. I went to Mark's closet, a place I had avoided since he died. It was too painful. It still smelled of him, that faint scent of cedar and his aftershave. I ran my hands over his suits, his shirts, the life he had left behind. My grief felt sharp and fresh again, a raw, open wound. For a moment, my resolve wavered. What was I doing? Fighting a war in a house of memories. Then my hand brushed against something hard in the pocket of his old tweed jacket, the one he wore on weekends. It was a key. A small, simple, silver key. On the attached tag in his familiar handwriting was a number and a single word. "Bank." I stared at it. I remembered now. A safe deposit box. He'd gotten it years ago after a minor robbery in the neighborhood had spooked him. He'd put important documents in it, things he called the deep files. He'd given me a key, which I'd promptly lost. This must have been his copy. "For emergencies, Lily," he had said, kissing my forehead, "so you never have to worry." The next morning, I feigned a migraine. I told Alina I needed to be left alone in the dark. She was cloyingly sympathetic, offering me tea and cold compresses. It was the perfect cover. I drove to the main branch of the bank downtown, the key clutched in my hand so tightly its teeth left imprints on my palm. The process was surreal. The hushed quiet of the vault, the polite bank manager, the clanging of the metal gate. It all felt like a movie. When the manager slid out the long, heavy metal box and left me alone in the private viewing room, my hands were trembling. I lifted the lid. It was filled with papers, neatly organized in manila folders, deeds, stock certificates, and on the very top, a thick, sealed envelope with my name on it, Lillian. My breath caught in my throat. I tore it open. Inside were two things. The first was a letter. It was several pages long, written in his hand. It started with, "My dearest Lily, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened." I had to stop, pressing my hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. I read it through a blur of tears. It was a love letter, a confession, and a warning. He spoke of his love for me, of how I was the true partner in his life. He also spoke of his family. He loved them, he wrote, but he was not blind to their possessiveness, to their belief that the business and the estate were their birthright alone. "They see it as bloodline," he wrote, "but we built it with love and work. You built it, Your inheritance was not a gift to them, Lillian. It was an investment. You are not a guest in their house. You are its co-owner. Never let them make you feel otherwise. He told me about the document he'd enclosed, the one he'd had drafted by an outside firm when I'd invested my inheritance. The one he'd never told Richard and Alina about in detail because he knew they would have fought it. Beneath the letter was the second document. It was thick, bound in a blue legal cover. The M&L Croft Partnership Restructuring and Succession Agreement. I read it slowly, my heart pounding with every clause. Mr. Harrison had been right. It was all there, spelled out in unforgiving legal language. It detailed my capital investment, classifying it not as a loan, but as the purchase of a majority stake in the holding company that owned both the business and all its assets, including the estate. And then I saw it. The final, critical clause. In the event of the death of one managing partner, their full share of the partnership and all controlling interest therein shall not be subject to probate or familial inheritance, but will be immediately and fully absorbed by the surviving partner. The room seemed to tilt. I read it again, and again, absorbed by the surviving partner. It didn't just mean I own my half. It meant I owned it all, the business, the investments, the house, everything. Mark hadn't just protected me, he had empowered me. He had foreseen this exact betrayal and created a fortress for me, not of evidence, but of ownership. I sat there in the cold, sterile viewing room for a long time, holding the papers in my hand. The letter from my husband. The legal document that changed everything. I thought of the grand family portrait hanging over the fireplace. Richard, the stoic patriarch, Alina, the proud matriarch, Clara and her children, the designated heirs. All of them smiling, secure in their lineage, in their legacy. A legacy that, according to the papers in my hands, now belonged entirely to me. They thought they were erasing me from their story. They had no idea they were just a chapter in mine. I carefully placed the documents back in the box, my hands no longer shaking. A profound, crystalline calm settled over me. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was no longer tangled up with fear or confusion. It was clean, pure. I walked out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sun. The world looked different, sharper. That night at dinner, the conversation was the same as always. Richard talked about the stock market. Alina talked about the garden club. They spoke as if I weren't there, their words flowing around me like water around a stone. I watched them, really watched them for the first time in months. I saw the entitlement in the way Richard held his fork. I saw the quiet arrogance in Alina's smile. They were so comfortable, so certain. They were living in my house. They were eating my food. They were planning a future with my assets. I took a quiet sip of water, the crystal cool against my lips. I didn't say a word, I just smiled. A real smile this time. That's when I realized they hadn't written me out of the story. They had just handed me the pen. The pen felt heavier than the key. The key had unlocked a box. The pen would rewrite a life. I walked back into the house that afternoon, the documents from the safe deposit box safely with Mr. Harrison. The air inside felt exactly the same, thick with the scent of Alina's potpourri and generations of unspoken rules. But I was different. I moved through the rooms with a new kind of silence, a new kind of sight. I saw the heavy velvet curtains not as elegant decor, but as fixtures in a property I now controlled. I saw the grandfather clock in the hall not as a family heirloom, but as an asset. It was a cold, clarifying perspective. The house was no longer a home filled with ghosts and judgment. It was a balance sheet. At dinner, they were in fine spirits. Richard had had a good day on the market. Alina had secured a prime table for her upcoming charity luncheon. They chattered on, their conversation a well-worn path I was no longer required to walk. Clara called, Alina announced, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. She's found the most wonderful boarding school for young Thomas. A bit of a stretch financially, but it's an investment in his future. In the family's future. She glanced at me then, a flicker of something sharp and assessing in her eyes. It was a test. She was reminding me of the lineage, of the rightful heirs who had costs associated with their legacy. A week ago, I would have felt the subtle pressure to offer support, to nod along, to be the benevolent widow. Tonight, I just smiled. That's wonderful news for them. My simple, unadorned agreement seemed to throw her off. She had expected more. deference perhaps, or a touch of melancholy that would have reassured her of my fragility, she received neither. I was no longer playing their game. I was setting up a new board. A few days later, their anticipated move finally came. It was delivered, as all their cruelties were, with a veneer of civility. Richard asked to speak with me in the study, his study, as he now thought of it. Eleanor was there, of course, seated in one of the leather armchairs, a picture of supportive concern. The grand family portrait stared down at us from over the fireplace in the adjoining living room, a silent, smiling witness. "Lillian," Richard began, clearing his throat. He adopted the tone of a man delivering difficult but necessary news. "Eleanor and I have been talking, and we feel it's time to discuss the future." "Your future," Eleanor added softly, leaning forward. "We've been so worried about you, rattling around in this big house all alone." I remained silent, letting them weave their net. "The business," Richard continued, "is becoming more complex. It needs a clear line of succession, a firm hand. And the estate, it requires a great deal of upkeep. It's too much for you to manage, emotionally and practically." He paused, letting the insult settle. "What we propose," he said, getting to the point, "is a generous buyout. We've had our accountants draw up a figure. It would allow you to find a lovely, more manageable place of your own. Near the sea, perhaps. You've always loved the sea." He slid a folder across the polished desk. It was their offer, their dismissal, their final, polite shove out the door. I didn't look at it. I simply looked at him, then at Eleanor. I saw the barely concealed eagerness in their faces. They thought this was the end. The final, neat tying up of a loose end. "You're right," I said, my voice calm and even. "It is time to discuss the future." A wave of relief washed over Eleanor's face. She thought I was agreeing. "I've also had my lawyer looking into the structure of the estate and the business," I went on. "He has some documents he believes are pertinent to this discussion. He suggests we all meet in his office to review them." Richard's posture stiffened slightly. "Your lawyer." "Lillian, there's no need to bring outsiders into a family matter." "Oh, but this isn't a family matter anymore, Richard," I said, the words feeling cool and clean in my mouth. "It's a business matter. And I believe it's best if we handle it professionally." His eyes narrowed. For the first time, he saw something in me other than a grieving, pliable widow. He saw a stranger. Eleanor shot him a warning look, then turned back to me, her smile back in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, dear, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. We only want what's fair." Fair, the word was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. The days leading up to it were thick with a new kind of tension. They were still polite, still civil, but there was a watchfulness to their movements now. They were trying to figure out my angle, what small, insignificant card I could possibly think I held. They were looking for a pawn, never suspecting they were facing a queen. The morning of the meeting, I chose my outfit with care. A simple, well-tailored navy dress, understated pearls. I looked not like a victim, but like a chairwoman of the board. As I was leaving, I passed the living room. I paused and looked at the photograph on the mantel. I saw the lie of it, clearer than ever. The forced smiles, the performance of unity, the empty space where I should have been. I felt a strange sense of pity for them. They had worked so hard to create a perfect image, they had forgotten to check the foundations on which it was built. We drove to the lawyer's office in separate cars. Mr. Harrison's boardroom was on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city. It was a world away from the dusty, claustrophobic legacy of the estate. The table was long and made of dark, polished wood that reflected our faces like a still lake. Richard and Eleanor arrived with their own lawyer, the old family friend. They were a united front, confident and composed. They greeted me with strained pleasantries. We all took our seats. Mr. Harrison sat at the head of the table, a slim file in front of him. I sat to his right, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Richard's lawyer began, his voice smooth and practiced. He spoke of his client's deep affection for me, their concern for my well-being, and their desire for an amicable and equitable solution. He spoke of lineage, tradition, and the continuation of the family business. He then presented their offer again, sliding the same folder across the table. A very generous proposal, designed to secure Mrs. Croft's comfort for the rest of her life. A deep, profound silence followed. All eyes turned to me. I didn't speak. I simply nodded to Mr. Harrison. He opened his file. "Thank you, James," he said to their lawyer. "We appreciate the sentiment. However, I believe your clients may be operating under a significant misapprehension regarding the ownership structure of the Croft enterprise." Richard shifted in his seat. Alina's smile became fixed. "My client, Lillian Croft," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice calm and steady, "is not a minority shareholder, nor is she a beneficiary to be managed. She is, in fact, the sole proprietor." The silence that followed was no longer profound. It was a vacuum. It sucked all the air, all the sound, all the smug certainty out of the room. Richard's lawyer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's absurd. Mark Croft's shares would have passed to his estate." "They would have," Mr. Harrison interrupted gently, "had they not been subject to a superseding partnership agreement. An agreement I have right here." He slid a document across the table. Not a copy, the original with its heavy blue legal cover. I recognized it from the safe deposit box. Richard stared at it as if it were a snake. He wouldn't touch it. His lawyer, James, picked it up, his expression shifting from confident to confused as he began to read. Alina looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this, Lillian? What have you done?" "I haven't done anything, Alina," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mark did it, years ago. He did it to protect our investment, to protect me." James looked up from the document, his face pale. He looked at Richard. "He's right, Richard. It's all here. The succession clause, it's ironclad. Upon your son's death, his entire stake, his controlling interest, it transferred directly to Lillian. It's all hers." Alina made a small, choking sound. "The house, the business. Everything," Mr. Harrison confirmed quietly. "The holding company owns all assets, the estate, the equity portfolio, the company itself. And Mrs. Croft owns the holding company, in its entirety." Richard finally reached for the document, his hand trembling. He flipped through the pages, his breathing growing shallow. He was seeing the signatures. His son's, mine. He was seeing the truth he had so conveniently ignored. This is a trick," he stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "A forgery." "I assure you it is not," Mr. Harrison said. "It was drafted by one of the most reputable firms in the country and filed correctly at the time. It is legally unimpeachable." The reality began to crash down around them. I could see it in their eyes, the dawning horror. They hadn't come here to generously buy me out. They had come here, hats in hand, to beg for a place in my world. Alina turned to me, her composure finally shattering. The mask of the elegant matriarch fell away, revealing something ugly and desperate beneath. "You can't do this," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "This is our family's legacy. It has been in this family for generations." "The legacy was bankrupt when I met Mark," I said, the words quiet but firm. "My inheritance saved it. Our asterisk work rebuilt it. This document simply honors that truth." "You were an outsider," she cried, tears of fury welling in her eyes. "You were nothing until my son married you." And there it was, the poison that had been sitting beneath the surface all along. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I looked at the two of them, stripped of their power and their grace, reduced to bitter, frightened people. "The family," I said, the words hanging in the air. "That's what you were so concerned with, preserving the picture of the family." I looked at Alina. "You took me out of a photograph because you decided I didn't belong. You were wrong. I don't just belong in the picture. I own the camera, the film, and the house where it hangs." I picked up my purse. I had nothing more to say. The documents had said it all. "Mr. Harrison will be in touch," I said to the room at large, "to discuss the terms of your departure from my property." I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The sound of Alina's choked sob followed me for a moment, and then it was cut off by the quiet, heavy click of the closing door. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. I felt a vast, quiet, and profound sense of peace. The war was over. The truth had won. When I arrived back at the estate, it was silent. Their cars were not in the driveway. The house felt empty, hollowed out. For the first time, it didn't feel like their house or our house. It felt like mine. I walked into the living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. My eyes went immediately to the mantelpiece. The grand, golden frame was still there. The smiling faces of the original family still beamed out, oblivious. A monument to a fiction. I walked over, lifted the heavy frame off the mantel, and carried it into the study. I didn't smash it. I didn't tear it. I simply leaned it against the wall, facing away from me, a chapter now closed. The mantelpiece looked stark, empty. A clean slate. I went upstairs to my bedroom. From a box in my closet, I retrieved the small silver frame that had been so unceremoniously removed weeks before. The one of my own wedding day. Mark and me, young, hopeful, unaware of the long, strange road ahead. I carried it back downstairs and placed it in the center of the mantel. Not as a replacement, but as a restoration. It was the true foundation of everything that had followed. In the days that followed, they moved out. It was a quiet, humiliating exodus. Movers came and went, taking their personal belongings, the pieces of their life that were truly theirs. They left behind the furniture, the art, the history that they had always considered their birthright. They never spoke to me again. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology. They simply vanished from my life, leaving only silence in their wake. Some nights, I would walk through the quiet rooms of the great house, the ledger in my hands. I'd run my fingers over the pages, over Mark's writing and my own. It wasn't a book of evidence anymore. It was just a story, our story. I learned something in all of this. Justice isn't always a loud, crashing thunderbolt. Sometimes, it's the quiet, undeniable truth of a signature on a page. Sometimes, it's the calm that comes after a storm you never wanted to fight. They tried to erase me, to make me a footnote in their history. But they forgot that history is not just about the pictures you frame. It's about the foundations you build, the debts you owe, and the truths you cannot outrun. Respect can't be bought or inherited. It's built moment by moment, signature by signature. That's what I learned. I stopped waiting for their acknowledgement. Peace was mine to find, right here, in the quiet truth of my own life. If this story reminded you that true strength is often found not in a shout, but in a quiet, undeniable fact, please subscribe. There are more stories here waiting to be heard, more truths waiting for their moment in the light. Thank you for listening.